look, if it get dark now, you just ride it, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do I do that?
First off, Causeway was a wonderfully effective drama about friendship, and one of the main interesting parts of that movie was how James and Lindsay, they didn't end up getting in a relationship, but rather in a friendship. What did they find in friendship that was so much more powerful than having the usual story where they fall in love and have kids and all that?
Was just going down the rabbit hole of like, what would their kids be like? That's where you just sent me. I'm like, Thank you for your really kind words on the movie. I'm endlessly fascinated by the ways in which the project of forging intimacy of any kind, romantic, sexual, or platonic, just real, live, scary as hell intimacy, is so often characterized by kind of contradictory impulses to reach out and then retreat, to connect and then to self-protect. I think what both of these characters need is to be genuinely vulnerable to another person, to give themselves permission to be seen and known by another person in all of their frailty and their complexity. So I think of part of their journey in the film towards each other, hopefully, even if the end of the film remains open in some way, precise outcome unknown, is that I hope both of these people have moved one potentially small step forward towards allowing themselves to be known.
Yeah. How do you, outside of trauma, which is, which sort of connects Lindsay and James together, what is it that they see each other that like nobody else does? Because there's like a true connection just like right away where you're like, oh, like these guys would totally like have a beer or something.
I'm glad that you perceived that.
Yeah.
It's a funny thing what I am, sometimes it's slippery for me to think about what belongs to a character's conscious knowledge versus unconscious gravitational pull. So I always feel sort of like reticent to speak for the character's intentions, but what I kind of perceive or feel is that both of them, at a level that might not be totally conscious initially, feel some kind of kinship. I think they kind of smell that the other person has also maybe been through something, but I think they also perceive that the other person is private and maybe a bit boundaried. And I think that recognition draws them to each other and allows them each to feel like there's some possibility of safety, both because there is some shared potential experience, but also there are some walls. And then, of course, that feeling of kinship creates the space in which those walls can start to come down, but the forces that had informed what made them each self-protect rear their heads when the vulnerability arrives as the walls start to come down.
How did James manage to kind of keep his head up the way he did after going through something that must have been loaded with insurmountable regret?
I mean, I feel like you might want to ask Brian Tyree Henry about that. Yeah. I guess I would say I think of that character as a person of tremendous resilience. That's something I observed in a lot of people in New Orleans, Louisiana. That's a city that's been through its fair share of collective trauma, and they are a remarkably resilient population whose pride of place is just infectious. But I think of James as a tenacious person and a person who, from a place of great grief, is also, I don't think he's the kind of person who would want to make his own suffering somebody else's problem. I mean, and I would think it's not our problem, like, reach out. But I wonder if in part that's how that character might think about that.
Yeah. What do you think is the greatest challenge Lindsay and James have moving forward?
Do you mean after the film ends?
Yeah, like
Oh.
without giving it away. You know?
Well, I guess what I would say is that I always feel like what happens, like in my life in the theater when the lights go out, or in the movie when we cut to black, I always feel like that speculative, hypothetical space, it belongs to the characters and to the audience. What I guess I would say is that whatever the outcome of that final conversation, whatever his answer is, I see the end of this movie as kind of a beginning.
Yeah. So, how did? Where was I? I'm just going to cheat a little bit here, but this was your first feature film.
Yeah.
How was that experience? What have you learned from it?
How much time you got?
Right.
I've learned a lot. You are right. I have primarily been a theater director for the last 15 years, and this is my first movie. It's hard to distill, but if I had to, what I would say is that, you can talk to filmmakers, read a lot about it, but I think you have to live directing your first feature to begin to contend with the endurance that's required. As the director, you are the through line. You are there day in and day out, every step of the process, with a changing landscape of collaborators and creative processes, and you carry it with you. And the responsibility involved in that, the resilience involved in that, and the thrill of that, that was a transformative and revelatory experience.
Right. So, how did you? I think you talked about this a little bit, but what brought you to casting Russell Harvard? Was that his name? Who played Lindsay's brother? Yeah. How did he come about into this film? Because you don't expect her brother to be someone from the deaf community, but when it does it works beautifully in the film.
I'm glad you think so.
Yeah.
That character existed in the original draft of the screenplay I read for this film, but that scene did not exist. And in the course of developing the script, it became apparent to us that that encounter, meeting him, could be revelatory for our protagonist and important. So that scene was born, but the scene was not written for a deaf actor. I knew Russell Harvard's work from the New York theater community. I had seen him in a couple of plays, and I thought he was astonishing. I think he is astonishing. I think he's a movie star. That's what I thought the first time I saw him in a play. And I wanted to cast Russell.
How did you go about the production design with the film? Because you see New Orleans, but it's not like this bristling city full of life and all that. Instead, it kind of feels like a small town in a way.
Yeah.
Sort of like a place like Lindsay wants to get out of. Where you're like, oh, yeah, this isn't the New Orleans we all know. How do you go about getting that kind of look for the place?
Walking around the streets, spending a lot. We had. I had the unbelievable privilege and pleasure of working with a true living legend, Jack Fisk, as our production designer. And Diego Garcia, our director of photography, also a remarkable artist. We spent a lot of time walking around the streets of New Orleans and driving the streets. I had never been there. And I've spent now a lot of time in New Orleans in the last 3 years, and I am completely changed by my time there. It is a place of singularly rich cultural history and tradition. It is a place with an infectious spirit. The pride of place in that city is just wild and contagious. But what I think you are identifying in your question is that it also happens to be a singular American city that is most popularly recognized by way of its landmarks and some of its more iconic gatherings like Mardi Gras. It felt important to me in this film, given the intimacy with which I hoped we would encounter these characters, two natives of that city, that we might encounter a more private version of New Orleans. The spaces that belong to the true residents, a more intimate version of New Orleans, which really felt like a hometown.
So how did Jennifer Lawrence and Brian Tyree Henry get involved in this project? I believe from what I was reading, Jennifer actually shares a producing credit on this,
She
which
does.
is and kind of like a return to the indie world in many ways for her, kind of going back to her Winter's Bone roots.
All of the above true. This is the first venture of her production company, Excellent Cadaver. So this project began for me just over about 3 years ago when I read the original draft of this script and had a very intense initial reaction to it and attached myself to it. And really only a few weeks later, I found out that Jen had read it and had a similar reaction. And we had dinner. And we're so immediately aligned creatively, aesthetically. And I would say the ease of rapport between us significantly oriented around the depth of connection that we both felt to the material, but also just as two people who were getting to know each other, I think for both of us felt like an undeniable basis for a very fruitful creative partnership. And she signed on that night. In terms of Brian, and we were only in production a few months later, wildly enough, although courtesy of the pandemic and some hurricanes, we'd have to wait on the back end. But we started at that point. Brian, Tyree Henry, I've known since I was 19. I met him when I was in college, in undergrad, and he was in drama school. So I've known for a long time that Brian is an actor of uniquely astonishing ability. And upon reading the script, he was the first person I thought of for James Oakwood, and I really didn't feel that anyone else could play that role. So I remain pretty ecstatic and humbled that he wanted to be a part of my first movie.